We are live in the Asia Tech Podcast studio. My name is Graham Brown, joined by Rohit Mulani. Rohit, welcome.
Thank you, Graham. Really glad to be here.
It's great to have you here. Asia Matters tonight. We're talking all about why Asia matters. We're talking about the challenge of localization as well, which is not easy, given there's so many different markets in Asia. And we're going to go a little bit into the Middle East and beyond today as well. Yourself, Rohit, you are Singaporean through and through.
I am, yes.
Yeah. You were born here, you grew up here, you went to university here. You've seen all the changes. I know you are heavily involved in the startup scene here with your background. You are described, if you look at Rohit's LinkedIn profile, it's pretty awesome. Mr. Growth. I mean, that's what it's all about in the startup scene now. Growth hacking. So you've seen the startup scene here change. Even in recent years. I mean, I came to Singapore 6 months ago.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's not like I'm new to the startup scene, but there's a lot of people coming to Singapore now. There's a lot of people now looking at Singapore and Southeast Asia now as an opportunity. People coming from the outside. We're going to talk about that in the context of companies like, for example, Uber, who came here a while ago, and obviously, their story is history now. But, what is that challenge of coming into Asia and localizing your offer, and how you do that in different markets? So this is what we do in Asia Matters is the guests come here. We ask the guests to bring in the key stories they think can help us understand what's going on in the market at the moment. And we talk about it. So we analyze it. We break it down. So let's start at the top. I think an easy story to get us started about underrated Asian markets. So this is a story in your space. It's from Travel Daily Media. And shout out to Brett, who runs Travel Daily Media. And one of the articles that he published here was about where pawns become queens, 5 underrated markets here in Asia. Now, when we talk about Asia, we talk a lot about China, obviously. And China will come up again when we talk about Didi tonight.
Yeah.
But underrated markets here in Singapore is obviously a well-established market. People know about Singapore for talent, for startup investment. But we don't know so much about the other markets here. And just sort of going through this article, I want your thoughts on these. Being from your vantage point here in Singapore, what about your thoughts on these markets in the context of travel, which is your bag at the moment? Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, Israel, Taiwan. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think from a travel perspective, basically the markets are growing because people are starting to look for more different travel experiences. Not everybody's going to Japan, not everybody's going to Singapore. People want to go to Vietnam. People want to go to not just Bali, but the different islands of Indonesia. And I think that has brought more awareness to that space, and that's why travel has kind of blown up there. So you have Tina that we know.
Yeah, Tina Chichiko, sorry. Yeah.
She started an airline in the Philippines,
awesome.
which is amazing. And we also have AirSwift, which flies specifically to 5 or 6 different islands that were started 1 or 2 years ago. So I think there's just this greater awareness and this greater push to travel, and that's led to a lot more growth in the space and awareness in the space from a travel perspective specifically. Yeah.
There's a lot of sort of input factors there, isn't there, in Asia in terms of travel? We've got, for example, like the growing middle classes here in Asia, which is like, a huge story in itself. If we unpack that data, obviously China are a big part of that. That you look at now, I think the predictions are by 2030, 2/3 of the world's middle class will be here in Asia. Yeah. Just think about that in the context of travel. So what are we seeing now, for example, in travel, like in terms of the Asian traveler traveling around Asia? How much of that is a growth market at the moment?
So one of our core markets at Voyagin is the Japanese outbound travel. So historically, the Japanese have been less adventurous in terms of going out, and a lot of holidays have been within Japan itself because it just happens when you come from a very large country that you tend to travel within the country first. But we actually see a very huge shift in the number of Japanese going into Singapore, going into Indonesia, and going into Thailand as well. And these numbers are growing year on year to the tune of over 20% right now.
It's interesting. Because traditionally, Japanese went to France, they went to Paris, or they went to Milan,
Hawaii.
I've always seen Guam, but now to travel out to Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
Chinese travelers as well must be a big part of this because, if you go to Thailand now and just see the amount of tour groups coming from China, it's overwhelming in many cases, isn't it? I mean, that must be one of their first sort of experiences of going abroad in many cases for these sort of newfound middle-class Chinese consumers, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that sort of evolving, or is that still such a huge growth market here in Asia, like that Chinese middle-class consumer who just wants kind of like a foreign experience, or are they getting a bit more sort of advanced now?
So China is growing massively in terms of outbound travel, but it works a little bit differently in terms of how they travel. So it's very different. There aren't as many FITs,
What FITs?
So FITs are free independent travelers.
Right.
So they travel in these groups where it's basically led by a tour guide, and
With the little
umbrella,
yeah,
and you see 20, 30 of them, and there's also specific trips that they take. So, for example, I read an article recently about Chinese tour guides organizing shopping trips to Bali.
Yeah.
It's not something you really expect.
Yeah.
Why people go to Bali to shop, but they're picking up stuff like if I remember this article correctly, soap. They're picking up bed sheets. They're picking up pillows.
Really?
Yeah.
So they're going to Bali to buy that, not to buy like woodcraft or musical instruments or statues.
So they go in these buses, and the tour guides bring them there and say, okay, you guys are free to shop. And this shop in Bali was shut down for everybody except for the Chinese travelers that came in on the bus. And they also had to set a limit. Each person could only buy 10 items
That's
or 20
awesome.
items because they were getting sold out.
Right, bed sheets.
Yeah.
That's insane, isn't it?
Yeah.
Put that into context of Japan. I mean, I lived in Japan a number of years, and there was a word which is quite new in Japan, and it's bakugai. And in Japanese, it means exactly, baku means explode, and gai is a conjugation of to shop, and it means explosive shopping. And it was only used to describe Chinese tourists because it was such a new phenomenon. So Chinese tourists were coming to Japan and in busloads, and they were stopping at the Louis Vuitton store or the Prada store and shutting it down because they would just clean it out because they had money, and that's what they came to do. They didn't necessarily come to look at the signs. They came to shop.
Yeah.
It's insane. And that, you think about it now, all those shopkeepers and those retailers are having now to employ Chinese-speaking staff.
Yeah.
And have translators, and even take like WeChat and WePay, for example.
Yeah.
All these kind of like new like angles to their business that they never had. So, I mean, it's affecting everything, right?
Everything. I mean, I was in Finland when I was in Europe a couple of weeks ago, and they accept Alipay, they accept WeChat Pay in Finland, in North Finland.
Wow.
Close to, at the Swedish-Russian border, between, close to the Russian border, right? North Finland, where I basically went to see the Northern Lights, so as north as you can get.
Wow.
And they accept Alipay and WeChat Pay, and they speak Mandarin. The staff at the
That's insane.
Yeah, the staff at the
right up in the Arctic Circle almost.
We were past the Arctic Circle, yeah.
Wow. That's crazy. Well, it's interesting, isn't it, how much of an impact that has, and then where does it go from here? Because now that means anybody in the travel space, and ultimately anything that's outside of that, all the services, has to now account for a different type of consumer who has different needs, and then take on board new skills like Mandarin, for example, and take new payment systems and so on. So that's being impacted by this growing class of consumers in Asia. I mean, you can't ignore it, right? But then that will mature, isn't it? If you look at, for example, the trends in travel globally over the last sort of 30, 40 years, it's sort of gone in cycles, hasn't it? Like, for example, when Americans started traveling to the Caribbean or to Mexico, they would have gone in tours. Or when Europeans did that as well, they went in tours. Yeah. And that was the first generation of travelers. Like, I mean, I'm British. When the British used to travel, when they first went to Spain, they went in tours, right?
Yeah.
And they had a bit of a negative reputation because of the kind of behaviors. There were always like groups that went, and they were very British, and the Spanish had to accommodate them. But ultimately, that sort of changed. And like you said, FITs became the next sort of step. That now people became a bit more brave. They started going, venturing out from away away from the tour groups. I wonder if we'll see that as well in Asia as well, whether that's a trend developing now.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. It is a trend that's developing. More Chinese are traveling independently, and it's an opportunity for someone to capture the market, because traditionally with tours it's been booked offline, right? So you
Right.
book your hotel, you book your flight, you book your tours, activities, everything in one package, and it's been offline. So there hasn't been as much of an opportunity there. So people, I mean, the big companies in China are starting to get on it. So you have Fliggy that was set up by Alibaba, which is an e-commerce shop, and they sell travel tickets and tours and activities as well.
Right.
And they're dominating the market over there.
Okay. Well, let's take this conversation into localization. But it's the same field that we're talking about. We're talking about how do you, localization for a consumer, but also going into a market as well. Because this is a challenge, isn't it, going into Asia? Because for the last 30 years, Asia has been the warehouse for the world, right? It didn't have consumers of any note, really, apart from maybe Japan and more advanced markets. But now suddenly you have, this huge middle class who are buying stuff.
And they're online.
Exactly. So how do you localize for them? Let's sort of look at some of these stories. We'll go outside of Asia first to look at it.
Yeah.
And I think Starbucks is a great example. It has a history in Asia.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe we can talk about the story that you brought to us tonight about Starbucks going into Italy.
Yeah.
Because this is fascinating, isn't it? I mean, can we flash this story up now? This is the Forbes story. And I think we talk about this in the context of Italy and then bring it back into Asia. Because, Italy, coffee.
Yeah.
It makes sense. It's the home of coffee in many sense, in the modern sense. I know maybe Turks and Greeks might argue with us.
Yeah.
But, that whole sort of barista culture.
Yeah, so the inspiration for Starbucks was Italy, right? So Howard Schultz on a trip to Italy got the inspiration to start Starbucks.
Yeah.
And it's amazing that it took them 47 years to get in. But I think Howard Schultz has been very, very careful in his entry. He's left, I think. But Starbucks overall has been very careful in his entry into Italy. It hasn't gone in the way it's gone into other markets, the way that most businesses would expand. It's like, okay, this is what we have, this is what we sell, and we think we can sell it to the people there. So they have had to be very careful, because coffee isn't just a drink in Italy. It isn't a new lifestyle that they're selling. It's part of the culture. So, and there have been, I think, going through the story, I think they have a lawsuit pending because they're selling too expensive coffee.
Right.
There's been protests. There have been people unhappy about the fact that Starbucks has entered Italy.
Yeah. I mean, that, for example, it goes into depth about the lawsuit in this article, but also, there have been cases where, like, for example, when McDonald's went into certain markets, they've been challenged by local authorities. Even, for example, like you find this in Europe, in France, where they ban them from certain cities and so on. Eventually they get in, but, it's not what you would expect in a more of a free market where, anybody can get in. There are these sort of like incumbent attitudes towards certain brands, especially if they come from the outside, especially Italy and its culture and its coffee. It's the Americans coming in, bringing in their way of doing things. So what did they do right here? I know you said they've been a bit more sensitive, but this is a discussion we can take into the context of Asia as well, with many of the brands that have gone into Asia. What did Starbucks do right here?
So they've been very careful to try to not offend the Italians, and not go in with this message that we are here to teach you how to drink coffee. Because the American coffee drinking culture and the Italian coffee drinking culture is completely different, right? So they've been very sensitive to that, and they've adjusted themselves to cater to what the Italians are used to and what they actually like. So, for example, they've got locally roasted beans from local roasteries only. For all the pastries that you see in Starbucks, it's baked by an Italian bakery. And that's something that they've been very careful to do, and not have the stuff that you see kind of manufactured in a factory or off-the-shelf kind of things.
Where does that come from? If you were going into a market and you were a Starbucks, what is required of the organization to better come out with decisions like that? Whereas maybe, for example, if you were a global business, you have franchises, you have a brand which you have to protect, you have a standards manual which has to be followed. How is it that Starbucks is able to do that and be a little bit more flexible going into a place like Italy?
So I think it's the humility that Starbucks has, and they've studied the predecessors that have failed. So Ben and Jerry's has gone in there, Haagen-Dazs has gone in there. Again, a very contentious area, which is gelato and ice
Right.
cream.
Yeah, you can't teach the Italians how to make or eat ice cream, right?
Exactly. So they've definitely studied their predecessors that have failed and the ones that have survived. So Domino's is still in there, for example, and they've differentiated from the typical pizzeria as the delivery option. So they've studied. I'm 100% sure they've studied that. And they can see that I think people in general are very resistant to change when it's a cultural thing. So you mentioned like France banning McDonald's initially and stuff like this. It's because it's not a restaurant. It's a culture that's coming in. And I think that's what people are especially resistant to when it comes to from a nationalistic agenda and a culture incursion basically coming into their space. So I think Starbucks has done that. They have had that humility, and they basically have said, and their actions have proven in a very subtle way, that we are not here to teach Italians how to make coffee. That's not what they're trying to do at all.
Yeah. And you talk about the culture. I mean, that's a very, it's a very sought after word and thing in corporations these days, to have that kind of culture, that dynamic culture. And we hear everything from customer centric culture to diversity within the workplace, and people are very conscious of the fact of who they are, what they stand for, and how they behave, rather than like big top down level branding strategies. And people are talking about these things now, and I wonder how Starbucks has encapsulated that, going into the, how it actually works inside the corporation, right? Rather than you could have somebody sitting at the very top level and saying, right, okay, we're going to listen to the customer, and we're going to be customer first and customer centric, and this is going to be our mission statement. It happens at the grassroots level all the way up within the organization, isn't it? And I think the more you study Starbucks and see how it works, the more you understand that marketing and growth in many ways is really about the day-to-day dynamics of a company and who they are, what they do, and not necessarily grand banner level strategies. It's about the people and the metrics that they measure people on, and how they treat their people in the store, and how they reward their people, and how they sort of like measure feedback and so on. So, I mean, do you have any sort of insights on that in terms of how these organizations work and how they do that well?
So I think it is very much like a startup culture, right? So I had lunch with a startup founder earlier today, and the one piece of advice he gave me was the people matter the most. Like, he would prefer an A-class team with a B-class product than a B-class team with an A-class product.
Yeah,
and that is so true, right? So it's the people that matter, and I think it's when you're small that you can influence that. If you get the right people and you give them the autonomy to make decisions, and you basically empower them, then they're gonna think as though they're the company, rather than they're just working for a company.
Yeah.
And if they have that, and that spreads as you grow, then you have this kind of culture that Google has and Facebook has or had, and and Starbucks has as well. So they have amazing employee benefits. People have basically grown up from baristas, or been promoted from store baristas all the way up to managers and even working in the corporate offices. So you have these employees where Starbucks have changed their lives. And
it's like the health insurance, right? That that was not mandatory in the US, but they said, right, everybody who works in the store in the US is going to have health insurance cover.
Yeah, and university.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And fund their ongoing education and everything.
Yeah.
So I think that it's really interesting, isn't it? If you get the culture right and you get the right people, like you had this conversation today, the right people, will find a way. They will then make that work. If you go into Italy, they'll find a way. You don't necessarily have to have a top-down edict.
Yeah.
Right, we're going to go in, we're going to do this, and then everybody's going to sort of follow and get on board with this. With the right people and the right culture, that kind of works, doesn't it? The DNA is there for them to be responsive and to be sympathetic, empathetic to the kind of people they're dealing with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you look at any of the world's largest organizations, none of the CEOs can make every single decision, right? And they're just well-oiled machines running because they have the right culture and the right people.
Absolutely. Good. Well, let's sort of now take that into the context. I mean, maybe we can bring in the Carreem one now, because that sort of leads us into Asia and also that conversation about Uber and about Grab, which really is a continuation of people and culture and it's not necessarily about having great products or even like the best people at the top level. The strategy is about what sort of permeates throughout the culture and what companies do at the local level and how they hyper localize. So can we get this Kareem one up? So this is from the Middle East, started by a guy from Pakistan, right? Who was a Stanford graduate, I think. I can't remember the story. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about Kareem and who they are.
So Carreem is the Middle East competitor to Uber. They're in, I think, 30 countries around the Middle East, which is more than Uber is in as well right now. And they are essentially kicking ass, and they're doing an amazing job in the Middle East. So they are the leader right now in the Middle East. In the cities where Uber is in, they're pretty much on par. But because they're in so many more cities, they're actually the leader in the industry right now.
What is it that they do that Uber doesn't do? Because Uber has the resources, Uber has the mind share, and Kareem are just like local guys, Middle Eastern and Asian guys. What are they doing right?
Yeah, so Carreem, very similarly to Grab, right? They've hyper-localized. They've been able to focus where Uber hasn't. And they've got the right culture, not just from the employees, but also with their customers. So one thing that I find really interesting is this Kareem logo. So the Kareem logo is a winking face.
Right.
You can see it up there. Yeah, you can. It's a winking face, and the reason that it's a winking face is that it's about the smiles that they bring to their customers.
Interesting.
And that's something very different when you see all these sleek startup logos today that
Uber.
don't mean anything. So I think that's really like personalization, and that has worked. And people actually value that. Also, the fact that Kareem was there before Uber, and they were able to bring change essentially to, and bring this mobility to people that didn't have that before. I think that also breeds a lot of loyalty within their customer base right now.
I know you mentioned they hyper-localized. That could easily become, a platitude. We got to hyper-localize, guys, But what exactly is that? And how is that actually tangible within an organization? What are they doing that is actually substantial rather than, we just happen to be run by local people? There's got to be a lot more than just that, isn't it?
Yeah, so I think it's understanding not just the specifics of it. So for example, one of the things that they did, which Grab also did, was they started accepting cash payments straight up front. And Uber took 18 months to do that in Southeast Asia. Right, and they lost a lot during that time because people were just not willing to put their credit card in. Southeast Asia, the number of unbanked is massive. They don't have credit cards, and they're not going to be able to use credit cards. So you just completely wiped out a portion of the market. And Grab didn't do that because they realized that not everybody has credit cards, which is something maybe it was hard for the team launching Uber to figure out, or they just thought it wasn't a large enough market. So Kareem did that as well. They started out straight away with cash. And again, when Uber entered, they didn't have cash at that point. So that was a large segment of the market that they could already capture. But I think what they did really well was figure out the fact that that the culture there is that, for example, in Saudi Arabia, women were banned from driving up till recently. So what Kareem was able to do was bring mobility to women and branding it that way, selling it that way, rather than, okay, we're a ride-hailing app. We transport you from location A to location B is completely different. Those are almost two different products when through the lens that you view it in. And then seeing the fact that, okay, women can't drive, we need to provide them mobility, then different questions come up. Okay, are they willing to ride? Okay, it has to be safe, number one. Number two, their reputations need to be intact. So you can't have, because it's a culture where women are not allowed to talk to men who are not part of their family, right? So they even went through small little things where they actually had trained their drivers not to look in the rearview mirror, but only to look in the side mirrors so that they wouldn't observe the woman in the back because it was not right culturally. So small things like this that actually paid off because then from the consumer point of view, they're more comfortable doing that, right? They're more comfortable as a woman, potentially, if they're more comfortable riding in a Kareem where the rider doesn't look in the mirror, where the rider doesn't talk to you, doesn't make small talk because it's culturally more accepted, then you're going to use Kareem more than you're going to use Uber if they don't do those things.
So you mentioned, Rohit, small things, and you may argue, for example, like training a driver not to look in the rearview mirror at the passenger, that's not going to be a showstopper or a deal breaker across the Middle East and Asia. That's not going to make Kareem win and Uber lose in the grand scheme of things. But is it just lots of small things that add up? Is that what hyperlocalization is, or is hyperlocalization a strategy, or is it just like small touches, small sort of like nuances of the people and the culture and so on? Is that how it's actually expressed, rather than looking for this grand, here's the hyper-localization team, this is what they do? Is it just sort of making people empathetic or aware, to these sort of local differences?
I think it's the small things that can only come up from experiencing the culture yourself or being extremely aware of it. So like you mentioned, it would become a platitude. For example, cash, right? Accepting cash, which was something that they did to localize, but Uber could obviously go and accept cash. And in that instance, then it becomes a platitude and you're equal and you're on equal footing.
Yeah.
But these small things are what add up to a customer experience. And the customer experience is king. Right?
Absolutely.
When the customer has a great experience and they're left with a nice taste in their mouth, they're going to keep coming back over and over again. And that is essentially what builds up your retention. That's what builds up your loyalty and your advocacy, and they bring in more customers. And then it becomes a flywheel and a machine.
Yeah, that's the keyword, customer experience, isn't it? Yeah. It's like, when you go into Starbucks, I don't know if they do it here in Singapore, but in other countries they may do it. They'll ask for your name and they'll write it on the
they
cup.
do it here.
Is that sort of customer experience? Is that sort of small touch that makes a difference?
Yeah, so I think when Starbucks came out, and I haven't read anything recently, but if memory serves, when Starbucks initially launched, the fact that the baristas were talking to the customers was different.
Yeah.
Because back in the States, at 9 a.m. in the morning, you don't want anyone talking to you.
Yeah.
Right? So the fact that the baristas were talking to you, asking you how your day was, this was a culture shift at that point. Asking for your name, writing your name. And it actually, there's psychology behind that. By asking your name, you're making a connection. And I think one of the biggest barriers to overcome is to introduce yourself to somebody psychologically. By them asking what's your name, they have your name, they also repeat your name, which makes you feel validated that they know your name now.
Yeah. And you belong as well, right?
And you belong, yeah.
That's what it's about.
Exactly.
Yeah. And these are individually, you maybe isolate these. I know these sort of are brought up as examples in case studies.
Yeah.
As individual examples of experience, they're not much. They're only like a 1% here and a 2% here, but it's a lot of these, isn't it?
Yeah.
Down to the fact, like the furniture that they have in Starbucks, or like, for example, we talked about with Carreem, there's small touches and it all adds up rather than, brilliant, we've got this multi-billion-dollar ad campaign selling who we are, and how we communicate with the market. Yeah. It's all sort of what's going on at this sort of DNA level, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the DNA level, but I think it comes in the way that it comes from upper management is what upper management stands for. So in terms of culture, what they stand for, and this is just the way that culture and the values of the company shine through. So for example, I think Carreem was founded because the two founders wanted to bring jobs into the Middle East and Pakistan. And it shines through in the little things where I can't remember what Uber calls them, but Grab calls them driver partners.
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
And Kareem calls them captains. And it's because also from a cultural point of view, you're essentially showing respect to the people that make up your business.
Absolutely.
Right? And I think that was...
What does Uber call them? Drivers?
I can't remember.
Probably. Maybe somebody can let us know if they're listening. So.
And Kareem's use of captain, for example, when the drivers came into the office, they were treated with respect. Good morning, sir. How are you doing today? A
captain is somebody of worth. There's somebody of rank and stature, right?
Exactly. And this shines through because the core reason that the business was founded was to help these people. Yeah. It wasn't to make money. It wasn't specifically to grow into a multi-billion-dollar business and disrupt the taxi market. That wasn't the reason the business was founded.
So, as an example, this is well documented. Disney, obviously, all about the experience and creating happiness and memories. The happiest place on earth. If you go to Disney World, for example, I know that they call their employees, quote unquote, cast members. So you think about, where do you ever see cast members? It's on a movie set, right?
Yeah.
So if you're in the cast, if you're doing the teacups in Disney and spinning the teacups. You're not like the teacup guy or the employee of Disney. You're a cast. You're in the cast, right? And again, it's that small touch by calling people these, giving them these terms and these names, these roles. It's creating those small touches, and the expectations of them change as well. And it's not like maybe they had this sort of top level strategy about this is what it's going to be to create this massive customer experience. It's all about lots and lots of little things.
Yeah.
And I suppose now, bringing into the context of Asia, it's like going into these Asian markets now, whether it's the 5 markets, the underrated markets we set up, or capturing that middle class that's growing here in Asia, is about not necessarily going in with this sort of top level strategy, but being able to identify lots of small nudges, small changes that you can affect within the organization. So, I mean, put this into the context of here in Singapore, we've had Uber.
Yeah.
And I think they're completely out now. I don't even know if Uber Eats is operating.
No, Grab Food took over.
Right. So Grab have taken the place. And if, for example, if you're listening from outside, maybe we can just put people into the context. Grab is the largest taxi ride-sharing app here in Singapore.
Southeast Asia.
Southeast Asia, yeah. I mean, originally from Malaysia,
Yep.
based in Malaysia, came to Singapore, and Uber effectively handed over the business or conceded to Grab right here in Southeast Asia. What do you think that was? Do you think, going back to, what you talked about, for example, like driver partners, or was it something more fundamental, or was it the cash, or was it, I mean, I've heard people say, they allowed a lot of their drivers who are Muslim to take prayer breaks, small things like that.
Yeah.
Because the Uber algorithm rewarded back-to-back non-stop driving.
Yeah.
Whereas, if you're a Muslim and you had to pray,
That doesn't work.
Right. So I'm just wondering your thoughts on that. I mean, being in this space, like in travel and hospitality and so on, what are your thoughts about how these guys actually did and why they were winning? And also maybe we can take that conversation to Gojek and maybe some of the other players here in Asia.
Yeah, I think it comes down again to like what you mentioned is more an understanding of the market, essentially, right? The fact that you understand that Muslim drivers need to pray how many times a day, or they need to go to the mosque on Friday afternoon. So you're not going to penalize them for not being online and not accepting rides when it's close to that time. And that's just something that if I'm guessing an engineer who doesn't have any context in Silicon Valley is building on Uber, he's not going to be able to build that. The team there, it's not going to be able, if they don't have context, they're not going to be able to identify that. And I think what Grab did initially, the way they got traction, was they were just better because they were able to identify the needs of the market. So, for example, Grab launched Grab Bike way before Uber launched Uber Bike, or Uber Ride, or whatever they called it. But essentially, Grab launched that because going into capital cities like in Thailand and Indonesia and Vietnam, you've got deadlock. And I love this quote that was in the article that whilst Uber cars were stuck in traffic, Grab bikes were snaking through and getting people around the city faster and for cheaper.
Yeah.
So that's something that they essentially saw the same, that the goal was the same, right? Getting people from point A to point B as quickly as possible, as comfortably as possible, but people wanted to get there fast, and they didn't want to sit an hour and a half in traffic in an Uber. They wanted to get on an Gojek, and that's how Gojek grew as well. They wanted to get on a bike and get there quicker.
Yeah, when you look at Gojek as well, I mean, they're lesser known as if you're outside of Asia, from Indonesia.
Yep.
And they seem to be an interesting sort of proposition that they may even be coming this way.
Yeah.
Which is fascinating, is that, could they outcompete against a Grab? If you were a Gojek going up against a Grab, how would you compete against them? Because Grab, they have the resources, they're local. How could you be more localized? If Rohit, I tasked you with that strategy, all right, you're going to take us into Singapore, how would you do it? Where would you start?
Yeah, I think personally, the starting point is to figure out what's working and what's not. Right, so Uber being in here, for example, the drivers would have had the complaint or the feedback that I'm never going to get the incentive because I have to take my prayer breaks. So that's a clear starting point for me. And I think Grab has had a couple of disgruntled customers recently since Uber have exited for a variety of reasons. So I think that's a great starting point. And how they can be more local, it may not be possible, because the small wins, the kinks may have been worked out. But again, if the core of the company is different and the culture is different, it will shine through in ways that you can't even imagine right now.
When you look at, for example, this is, I mean, obviously a challenge facing companies coming out of China now into Southeast Asia, because whether it's, you know, like the travel companies bringing the tourists or the tech companies, Didi are an interesting example. Do you know much about them? I mean, have you had much experience of them? They are the equivalent of Uber or Grab, but in China, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, your thoughts, can they sort of hyper localize? Because it's an interesting concept, isn't it? We've always thought about Western companies hyper localizing and going into Asia. It's now a realistic context or a concept that a Chinese company can come into Southeast Asia and hyper localized and do the same. You know, are they set up to do that? Are they in a good position to do that? Because, you know, Starbucks or an Amazon, for example, these companies have many years of, you know, frontline experience working with customers. They're not so new to the game, right? And they have a lot of wealth of knowledge that they bring with them. How are we sort of looking at the sort of the Chinese brands coming in to Southeast Asia?
Yeah, I think they've identified Southeast Asia as the nearest growth market. I know a couple of companies that are coming here, one of them being Ping An, as well, Ping An Insurance, and they're coming in here. I think they've launched with the wealth management product a while ago. So definitely they're coming. Their ability to localize, that remains to be seen, right? I think China is a completely different market, is walled off on its own, and customer needs, customer expectations are completely different. So I think if the team have the right processes, then absolutely they'll be able to take the market, because resource-wise, they're not lacking at all.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And, you know, in terms of the access to all those data sets that they have about their consumers, even like, for example, we talk a lot about retail, what's happening in China, how advanced they are, because they've got access to all that, you know, wealth of information about buying behavior and, you know, like interaction with, you know, the transactions, and that across all of those platforms, for example, that Alibaba runs, to be able to sort of join up all those dots and create a picture of a consumer as well. They have all that, but, you know, whether or not they're able to take that into outside of China into Asia is an interesting factor. I mean, you're starting to see Alipay, for example, show up like in Finland, as you say.
Yeah.
But it's a challenge, isn't it? Because, you know, that requires a lot of, you know, sewing up moving parts. You know, it's like there's a lot of focus now on the last mile delivery here in Asia.
Yeah.
And, you know, you have many, many different legacy systems, ways of doing things. So to be able to join all that up is going to take many, many years, and it's a real big challenge. So I'm just wondering like how we're sort of getting on with that, especially like looking at, you know, Chinese travelers bringing their, you know, requires of payment systems here in Asia, and whether that sort of helps the spread, you know, here in Singapore, for example, starting to see those payment systems showing up, whether that's going to be sort of like the vanguard of bringing that technology across to Asia. I'm just wondering if you're seeing that sort of at the front line, whether you're seeing the adoption of Chinese technology through these travelers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like nowadays, if you browse around most sites, you see a Facebook login, a Facebook Connect button that allows you to sign up for an account. Facebook, Google, sometimes LinkedIn. But now you're starting to see WeChat login page on site. As you mentioned, you're starting to see Alipay as an accepted payment method. They've done a partnership with Fave, I think, in Singapore, that also reaches out to the local consumers. So I think that is absolutely coming, and the travelers have spread that. Because initially, I mean, if you look at the initial marketing for Alipay, it was mostly in Mandarin. So it wasn't in English, which is the default marketing language in Singapore. But that's starting to change as well. And I think as we go more into wallets and the competition there heats up, and it's going more into a category king, one of these providers is going to become a category king, and that's going to change more, and the competitors are going to be more focused on advertising to get, for example, the Singapore market in.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, for example, I mean, I know it's a bit off topic tonight, but to talk about that in the context of e-commerce, I mean, here in Singapore, where we are with Amazon, Alibaba sort of meeting, it's just an interesting space, isn't it? Because you have really the embodiment of the discussion from this evening about hyperlocalization, and you have two of the best brands in the world to really sort of test that out coming from different angles. I mean, Amazon and Alibaba have so many resources, and they have the boffins on the job, right? And they have that sort of customer culture as well.
Yeah.
To come here in Singapore and that to play out, I just find that fascinating because, that really will be the future case study of hyper-localization. Whoever wins that is going to be the one that you say, they were the ones who got that right.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated to see how that's going to develop.
Yeah.
It's too early to call yet.
Well, I think right now Alibaba has a leg up because of the acquisition. If you're talking e-commerce, because of the acquisition of Lazada. So Lazada already went out, and built out all the infrastructure. They were able to do deliveries to all the islands in Indonesia, Philippines, and they've already got that leg up. Amazon isn't completely here yet. I think Amazon Prime also is quite limited in its existing form here. So I think right now Alibaba has the leg up, but Amazon is a juggernaut, and
you can't write them off.
Yeah, you can't write them off.
Yeah. Well, it's been fascinating, and your vantage point here in Singapore, seeing how things are developing in Asia, is always useful to sort of help people understand outside of Asia as well. What's going on. A lot of people now interested in Asia. A lot of people are interested in Asia because they have to be now. Now we get people from the west coast of the US who previously would have only looked at Asia if they were the emerging markets guy. Now are interested because, oh, look, something really interesting is happening over here. There's lots of great case studies. There are now interesting unicorns emerging.
Yeah.
There's some great startups, especially in the travel space, emerging now. And now we have this other factor, which is these potentially billions of middle-class consumers coming online as well, who now have sort of, consumption power.
Yeah.
What excites you, just in rounding up from this evening, what excites you about Asia right now? And, what excites you in terms of where we're going in Asia, rather than sort of trying to be a knockoff of Silicon Valley?
Yeah.
What's happening here right now that you think is interesting to people outside of Asia that they may not be expecting, or you think will help maybe later on in future go back to the West, take those ideas and help, make things better over there?
Yeah, so I think there's two things specifically that excite me. Number one, like you said, the rising middle class and the changing consumer expectations and wants and needs, essentially. So these people now have spending power, they now have purchasing power, and they want different things than they did before, and it's a massive middle class that's coming out. So I think the opportunities there are exciting, and finding there's going to be a variety of underserved needs, and that is opportunities, essentially. And the other thing that's exciting for me is that, so if you look historically at how the U.S. developed, the solutions coming out now has been because it developed this way, whereas Asia has skipped, or Southeast Asia has skipped ahead on a couple of things because it's developed later. So, for example, we skipped 2G in some instances and went straight to 3G. And China's been able to do that. It's basically jumped so far ahead in terms of smartphones because of cheap smartphones that became available there. And I think that going forward, going faster and going further is going to be something that might go full circle back to the US, where now you have solutions that are being developed on infrastructure without the legacy that could be interesting for us.
Right. I mean, that's very much the case in payments, isn't it? Where you don't have a generation of consumers who grew up with credit cards because they didn't have anything, right? So they've gone straight to mobile payments. And even in the sense there wasn't a legacy banking system of the kind of level that you'd expect in the West, for example. So they went straight to mobile payments. So that makes complete sense, right? And you now have the biggest payment providers, fintech companies are e-commerce players like Alibaba, for example. These are effectively the banks of the future, right? So that would be interesting in terms of how that develops. So I think, it's a very interesting space. Everything you talk about in terms of that sort of leapfrogging as well, in terms of technologies, mobile, obviously, a big part of it. And I just wonder as well what the future will look like when you have, let's skip forward to 2030, 2/3 of the world's middle class here in Asia. What will that mean? I mean, it's the gravitational pull of those consumers is obviously going to be felt everywhere in the world. But how will that affect, how people think about this region and affect, for example, our attitudes towards Asia 10 years from now, where this is obviously now it is the biggest market in the world, but at that point where, for example, if you are a brand, you have to come here.
Yeah.
This is the place. And that's going to affect everything, like media as well. You know, for example, if you were a rock and roll band and you grew up in the UK, you went to the US, if you toured,
Yeah.
now these guys are going to, you know, do their gigs in London pubs and then go to Beijing.
Yeah.
Like that's going to be normal, right?
Yeah.
And I'm fascinated. If you were a designer, you know, you weren't just doing London, Milan, Paris. You know, you're now doing Beijing or Shanghai Fashion Week, for example.
Yeah.
What's that going to look like in 10 years?
I personally think there's going to be more localization, and there's going to be smaller players popping up. So you have this movement towards large companies taking over and getting bigger and bigger, right? You got your Facebook, Googles, and all this. But I think that creates opportunities for smaller companies to come up. So if you're a designer that in London, Paris, and Milan, and you're also going to go into Beijing, but then you have the hyper-localized Chinese consumer, Chinese designer that serves the needs of the Chinese consumer. So I think that's going to be really exciting, and there's a lot of opportunity opening up in that space. And yeah, I'm really curious to see how that plays out as well.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, watch this space. Yeah, I love it. And I think that's what we want to kind of document here on Asia Matters, is those stories as well. They're sort of really hyper-localized stories and how people are getting it right. So Rohit, thanks tonight for bringing in these stories, and we'll put all the details in the show notes, but these are great example case studies of how it can be done, even by big companies as well as local companies, even Starbucks, you know, how it can, not just about local companies winning local markets, but also how people can go into local markets and get it right.
Yeah.
Right. It's not just about the small guys, the mom and pop stores. So thanks for sharing those with us. And Rohit, yourself as well, before I let you go, is that, you know, where can we find out more about you? So people that have listened this evening that may be interested to learn a bit more about your work and what you do and, you know, the things that you publish.
Yeah, so LinkedIn's a great spot. And you can also check out my website, which is mulani.co.co. So, yeah, and you can reach out to me there through email, phone, and stuff there.
Excellent. All the details in the show notes. Rohit Mulani, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Graham. It's been a pleasure.